The small neighborhood located just south of St. Petersburg, known as Driftwood, might seem like the kind of place where archaeologists would want to vacation instead of excavate. But in addition to the gorgeous scenery, the area was also the site of some of the first homesteads on the Pinellas Peninsula. Driftwood is located in southeastern Pinellas County and is situated on the northern shoreline of Big Bayou, approximately 3 miles south of downtown St. Petersburg. Today, the roads through the neighborhood follow the contour of Big Bayou. Deep house lots paired with lush tropical trees and understory give Driftwood the feeling of an oasis within the suburban sprawl that now covers much of Florida. In December 2009, residents of the St. Petersburg neighborhood of Driftwood invited staff of the West Central Regional Center of the Florida Public Archaeology Network and archaeologists from the Central Gulf Coast Archaeological Society to visit Mullet Farm, a residence located in the historic subdivision. Mrs. Helen Gandy O'Brien and her daughter Kim, which you saw, Miss Helen was sitting on the stairs on the last slide in the picture on the top, wanted us to see a fairly sizable hole in the yard that had recently opened up, exposing a mysterious wooden box. Upon inspection, it appeared that the top of the subterranean box slowly rotted in place and finally collapsed, allowing 80 centimeters of overlying sand and an unsuspecting landscaper to fill the void. And so in this picture you can see this is the hole that opened up in her yard and the box is inside there, but I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. In June 2010, FPAN staff, neighbors, and volunteers began an initial phase of an exploratory shovel testing survey of the Driftwood neighborhood. Over 40 individuals, including longtime Driftwood residents and neighbors, University of South Florida students, and CGCAS members assisted in the survey. And in the picture on the bottom left of this slide, you can see one of our all-star volunteers. This is Miss Jenny. She's 91 years old. She's lived in Driftwood all her life, and she would come every week to collect all of our artifacts and wash them for us. So she was a huge help to us. Also during that summer of 2010, Dr. Wiseman's Archaeological Field School students also joined in. And later that summer, we also held a public archaeology day so that interested residents could learn more about archaeology and the history of their neighborhood by participating in a real archaeological excavation. Throughout that summer and stretching into the next fall semester, archaeologists and volunteers excavated some 140 shovel tests in 14 residential lots. In all, we recovered over 5,000 artifacts and made several interesting discoveries regarding the early history of Big Bayou and the Pinellas Peninsula. Although the lower Pinellas Peninsula was occupied first prehistorically, of course, and then much later by a few scattered settlers and fishing ranchos prior to the 1850s, the recorded history of Big Bayou starts with the arrival of Abel Miranda to the area in 1857. Miranda, a Menorcan and native to St. Augustine, visited the Tampa Bay area as an Army scout for federal troops during the Third Seminole War. In 1857, he purchased the land adjacent to Big Bayou, acquired a structure at Paul's Landing, dismantled it, and floated the timber south to his family's new place of residence. In 1859, Abel Miranda's brothers-in-law, John and William Bethel, also moved out to Big Bayou to establish their own fishing rancho. While the mullet caught by these early settlers was plentiful, life on the Pinellas Peninsula was rough, with few of the comforts provided by even the smallest frontier town. Miranda's settlement at Big Bayou was short-lived. However, during the Civil War, federal troops stationed at Egmont Key firebombed the homestead and forced the Mirandas' leave of Big Bayou for good. The attack represents the only foray on the Pinellas Peninsula during the Civil War and was apparently a reaction to accusations of Miranda's opposition to the Union blockading efforts of the Union troops at Egmont Key. So there was probably a very good reason that he was known then as the rebel terror of Tampa Bay. According to records of the event, troops anchored their gunboat at the mouth of Big Bayou and repeatedly shelled Miranda's dwelling, Citrus Grove and farmstead. After a day of bombardment, Miranda's home was burned to the ground, his orange grove destroyed, and his livestock killed. Miranda later vowed never to return to Big Bayou, saying, If I had built there again and it had come another war, the damn Yankees would have come in there with their gunboats and shelled and burned me out as they'd done before. Now I am where they can't get their gunboats through the woods to do it. After leaving to fight in the war, in 1867, John Bethel returned to Big Bayou along with his wife Sarah and purchased Abel Miranda's old property, along with 68 additional acres along the shore of the bayou. In the years that followed, a few other families settled around Big Bayou, and several of these early homesteads can be seen on a coastal survey map originally issued in 1879. Most of these settlers farmed and fished to make a living, although several opened up their own small general stores. By 1876, the community at Big Bayou had come to be known as Pinellas Village and was beginning to thrive, even boasting a hotel and one of the first post offices on the Pinellas Peninsula. This post office was located in the Bethel Cottage, and John Bethel held the office of postmaster for 14 years before being replaced in the job by first his daughter Mary and then his wife. In 1907, the Pinellas Village post office closed for good when it was moved to the new town of St. Petersburg. While Pinellas Village thrived for a time, the decision to bring the terminus of the Orange Belt Railroad to the new town of St. Petersburg, just north of Big Bayou, caused a shift in the settlement of the area. In the spring of 1889, the last rail was laid, ensuring that in the future, Pinellas Village would be known only as a historical footnote. Many businessmen chose to move their operations from Pinellas Village to St. Petersburg in order to take advantage of the improved transportation there. The Bethel stayed put at Big Bayou, and in addition to manning the local post office branch, John Bethel worked as a carpenter and boat builder at the nearby shipyard. His sons, along with many other local residents, were involved in similar trade, working as builders, laborers, farmers, and fishermen. Although John Bethel died in 1915 at the age of 81, his family continued to live at Big Bayou and their home on Bethel Avenue. The 1920 census recorded his wife Sarah, along with 6 of his adult children, still living in the family home. During the 1920s and 30s, the area around Big Bayou began to change as development from St. Petersburg began to creep south. New roads and houses were built, and as can be seen on the 1923 Sanborn fire insurance map of the area, you can see on the slide here, this is where the Bethels were living, and this is Mullet Farm, where the mystery box is that I'll talk about later. Longtime resident of the area, Mrs. Helen, that's her on the stairs, remembers that during this time there were many pleasure seekers who would frequent the beaches of Big Bayou for parties and clam bakes. Also, there was reported to be a speakeasy called the Hawaiian Gardens located in the area and run by 2 of John Bethel's daughters during Prohibition times. The Bethels continued to live at the home at 100 Bethel Avenue until 1940, when the property sold at public auction for default on their mortgage. After being purchased by a developer, the Bethel tract was then set to be integrated into a new community being developed just next door, later to be known as Driftwood. The neighborhood now known as Driftwood began as a planned community created by local artist and amateur architect Mark Dixon Dodd in 1937. And that's a picture of him right there standing in front of one of the houses that he designed. From 1937 to 1941, Dodd designed 19 homes, each one unique in its design and many reminiscent of storybook cottages. Many of these homes were also decorated on the interior with custom paintings by the artist. And that's an example of one of the paintings that he did and is still hanging in one of the Driftwood homes. To add to the quaint feeling of the neighborhood, Dodd made it a point to keep much of the natural vegetation in place and redirected the local roads so that they meandered along the margin of the bayou. Dodd's homes sold quickly, and an ad in the St. Petersburg Times from 1940 warned interested buyers that there was only one home remaining for purchase. During the late 40s and 50s, more houses were added to the neighborhood by other builders, and today Driftwood is a sleepy community of families and retirees. While historical accounts describe the history of settlement at Big Bayou, it is not completely clear where some of these places were actually located. Prior to the start of FPAN's work in the neighborhood, longtime residents Mrs. Hallen and her daughter Kim O'Brien created a map of the area showing where they thought some of these historic buildings might have been located. Important pieces of Big Bayou's history, like the post office, the supposed shell fort, speakeasy, homesteads, and even the location of Civil War era cannonballs were coded on the map based on the reminiscences of Mrs. O'Brien as a way to share her memories of the area with newer residents of Driftwood. Aside from the recently discovered remains at Mullet Farm, these points of interest pertain to questions members of the neighborhood have asked about Big Bayou's first settlers. Was the mysterious box in Mullet Farm used by these pioneers or by later residents? What about the remains of the shell fort, and does it still exist? Does any evidence still remain of the infamous Hawaiian Gardens speakeasy? This map was great from an archaeological standpoint because it allowed us to compare what we were finding with the community's ideas about what should have been there historically. Because of this, the Driftwood Community Archaeology Project has created a platform for neighbors and others to engage in exploring the local past through systematic archaeological investigation. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through 5 of the different historical hotspots that the Driftwood residents were most interested in learning more about, and I'm going to discuss a little bit of what we found in relation to each one and how that matches up. Okay, so first, let me preface this section by saying that I'm more of a historical archaeologist, so if I misidentify something or speak incorrectly, please blame Jeff because he was supposed to be here to do this section, so that's all his fault. So the first stop on the map is the shell fort. You can see it up in here in this orange box. Residents identified an area in the northeastern portion of the color-coded map where there have long been reports of there being an old fortification made entirely of oyster and conch shells. Named the Old Fort or the Shell Fort by early settlers, the peculiar land feature is most likely the remains of giant shell heaps first reported by archaeologist S.T. Walker when he visited the Big Bayou area in 1879. Early settler John Bethel found the feature particularly intriguing and made a special note of it in his book about life at Big Bayou. He described it this way: "This fort covered about an acre of ground and had but 3 walled sides. One side faced northeast, one northwest, and one southwest. The southeast side was not walled up simply because the northeast and southwest wings extended to the waters of the bayou. The walls on the northeast and northwest corners were at least 3 feet high and gradually sloped to about 2 feet at the waterfront. This enclosure had 2 openings at the northeast and northwest corners, about 14 feet wide, possibly intended for sally ports. A remarkable circumstance about the enclosure was that the ground inside was about 2 feet lower than the land around the fort on the outside. How high this shell had been piled up originally, how long and by whom, is a mystery that will never be revealed. A great deal of shell remains there yet to mark the spot where the fort once stood. Though in clearing the land, the shells were leveled and the timber piled on them and burned to get it out of the way. Besides, much was hauled off and burned in kilns for fertilizer." So Bethel was not too worried about cultural preservation, but at least he wrote something about what it looked like. So Bethel's passage provides great details about the land feature and records the early clearing activities that altered its appearance and quite possibly its shape. Based on his description, later documents, and the things that we recovered from our survey, the earthen feature called the Shell Fort most likely originates during prehistoric times, long before Europeans arrived in the area. During our survey, we excavated a total of 18 shovel tests in and near the area identified as the Shell Fort. Within this particular lot, we had 16 shovel tests that were positive for cultural material. Of those 16, 11 contained prehistoric artifacts. So this is the map of the area, and the red ones are the ones that were positive for prehistoric material. In shovel test 2, which is this one right here, we recorded the presence of a 30-centimeter thick layer of fairly compressed marine shell in black, organic-rich soil located between 20 and 50 centimeters below the surface. And the picture right here, this is the profile of the shovel test, and you kind of can make out that compacted layer of midden right there. These remains are consistent with a prehistoric shell midden and not a European fortification. The midden deposit consisted of various marine shell, some faunal remains, and other prehistoric artifacts. Artifacts recovered in this minting component included prehistoric ceramics, such as Pinellas plain sherds, which are these guys up here. These artifacts help date an occupation of the site to the Safety Harbor period, which began approximately 1,100 years ago and continued until the contact period. Additional evidence within the same residential lot near to the Big Bayou shoreline points to an even earlier prehistoric occupation and possible origin of the shell fort. There, FPAM volunteers uncovered the presence of a layer of black compact soil between 50 to 80 centimeters below the surface. Below this, a layer of large whole whelk and conch shells in the black soil was documented at 80 centimeters. So in this picture here, this large lightning whelk here is one of the shells that we found in the lower midden level, and then these smaller ones here are the kind of shells that we found in the higher midden level, so you can really tell the difference. No diagnostic artifacts were recovered from within the layer of large shell remains. Just above it, however, researchers recovered a single prehistoric ceramic sherd identified as being limestone tempered and known as Pasco or Perico plain, and that's this little guy right here. This ceramic type is most commonly found to occur during occupations that existed between 2,500 to 1,300 years ago. This is further supported by the recovery of stone tools in and around Driftwood, 2 during this survey, which are these 2 here, and several by residents over the years. All the ones on this right side here are ones that local residents have found digging in their yards or doing different construction projects and things like that. So they let us record them. One of the stone points recovered by archaeologists appears to be an Alachua point, which dates from 5,000 to 1,000 BC. That's that one. Another point also recovered during the archaeological survey, and which dates to a slightly later time period, is the Hernando Point, which this one here is the one we found, and this prettier one over here is one that one of the residents found. Based on the proximity of these recovered artifacts, along with the material documented in our shovel tests, it appears that the foundation material to the land feature that is known as the shell fort first came to be long ago. We may never know the exact intention of its shape, but a more likely explanation for its origin of the shell fort than a European fortification, and one that is supported by what we found, is that of a prehistoric community pattern typical of late Minnesota and Safety Harbor period villages that ran along the shoreline. All right, moving into the historic period, the next area of interest that the Driftwood neighbors wanted us to investigate were the possible locations of the pre-Civil War Miranda homestead that got bombed out by Union troops, and the later homestead owned by Bethel and his family. So this is the area that we were kind of focusing on. All right, as I mentioned before, we were able to find this 1883 coastal survey map, and it shows that there was a cluster of buildings right there along the bayou around this time. So when we overlay that in GIS, it does kind of appear to be in the area of where like the Bethel house lot was, but this kind of map it's not exact enough to say for sure. So we just use that as kind of a starting point. Later, we were able to do some research into the land transactions that occurred during this time. So first, Bethel purchased, let me go back. Okay. Bethel purchased lots 1 and 2 in 1868 from Miranda. And then he must have gotten really lonely out there, because almost immediately he started dividing it up and selling it so he could get some neighbors, I think. But based on the property records that we saw, he probably wasn't the best businessman, because like I think one like 10-acre tract of land he sold for like a bag of potatoes and like $10. So he really wasn't making very good financial decisions. But maybe he was lonely, so it was okay. It worked out for him. So what we found was the area where we were surveying was mostly covered by the Bethel tract, which is I'll talk about later, right in here. And then This property here was purchased by Seth Lyon in 1879, and then it was sold to Thomas Sterling, who put several houses in the area and also a hotel during the Pinellas Village time period. And then this property over here in purple, it was first owned by Adolphus Russell, and it was purchased in 1882, and then it later became the area where Mullet Farm was built. So we were interested in seeing where some of these earlier structures might have been located. So we decided to focus on the distribution of 3 early artifact types that might have corresponded to the time period we were interested in. That included wrought nails, cut nails, and blue sponge painted ceramic. So this one here is the wrought nail, and that's just a nail that's made by a blacksmith. And those were used, from the time people started making nails until up into the 1700s and a little into the early 1800s. This one here is the cut nail, and those were most popular from the 1820s until the 1880s, 1890s, before they were replaced by wire nails, which are the same kind that we use today. And this, the blue sponge painted ware, those were pretty popular in the mid 1800s, and it was probably the cheapest decorated ceramic that you could buy. So it was very utilitarian, the kind of thing that you would find in not a very rich household. So when we plotted out the location of these 3 artifact types, we began to see a pattern to their distribution. There was a cluster of cut nails, wrought nails, and spongeware around the house in this area. When we overlaid the property data, we found that all of these artifacts fell within what was once the Bethel property. So we really didn't find many of these early artifact types outside of what we know is the Bethel house lot. So this area right here, we have an idea that there might have been an earlier house there, but we really can't say for sure until we do more testing in the area, whether it's related to the Miranda occupation, which was pre-Civil War, or whether the Bethels had a structure there after the Civil War. Okay, so the next area we were interested in looking at was also from the time of Pinellas Village, and is the Pinellas Post Office. And that's circled right here in green. Mrs. Hallen remembers that the old post office was located in this area, just at the end of Driftwood Road South and fronting on the water. As I mentioned earlier, the post office was in service from 1876 to 1907, and during its years, it also served as the Bethel family home. So we hope that we might come across some artifacts in this area that came from that late 1800s time period. All right, here's a map from 1876 of the post routes of Florida, and it zoomed in on Hillsborough County in particular. So this is the Pinellas Post Office right here. And as you can see, mail would have come on a steamer from Tampa across the bay and stopped at the Pinellas Post Office. Then it would have gone on horseback, or someone would have taken it on foot to the other settlers on the peninsula. And then the steamer would have gone up to the Clearwater Post Office, and then it would have gone out to the rest of the state or the country. One interesting item we found in the possible post office area was this small brass oval grommet. It was found about 80 centimeters down in one of our shovel tests along the shore, right on top of a layer of dark muck that might have once been submerged bay bottom. When we found it, we really had no idea what it could be. We didn't even know that it was a grommet. We thought it could be like a belt buckle or some kind of escutcheon to go on a keyhole, so we really had no idea what it was. But we did know that the post office might have been around here, so what I started to do was to look into what kind of things might be found in a post office of that time period. On the Smithsonian National Postal Museum website, they have a fantastic collection of postal items from throughout the history of the United States Postal Service, so I highly recommend checking out their website because it's actually really good. One thing in particular caught my eye, and it was an old mailbag that used a series of oval grommets along the top to secure the bag closed. So it was really exciting, and I got in contact with the people at the Smithsonian and sent them a picture of my grommet, and they probably thought I was crazy, but that's okay, because based on what they saw, they were able to determine that the grommet that we found is consistent with the type of grommets that were used on mailbags during the late 1800s. And this is a picture of this is an example picture that they sent us. This is a mounted mailbag from the late 1800s, and you can see here on the side there's a series of brass grommets, and they would have put the strap through them to secure the top, like for registered mail and things like that, so nobody could get into it. And they usually would have like a big padlock on there as well. Some of the other artifacts we found in the general area of the grommet also point to a late 1800s occupation. So this shovel test right here is the one we found the grommet at. And in this one right here, we found this piece of glass that is from an Udolpho Wolf schnapps bottle. It was like it was a medicinal gin that was popular in the late 1800s, and we found that this example was probably made between 1848 and 1880. So this is a picture of what the full bottle would have looked like. It's the style of the bottle is a case gin bottle because it's like flat on the sides. Over in this area, we found the base of a German beer bottle, and we were able to date that one to around 1880 to 1890. And again, this is a picture of what it looked like when it was whole. And then finally, my favorite artifact that we found out at Driftwood was a pitcher's Castoria fragment. So if you never heard of Castoria, it was kind of the saltine crackers and Sprite of its day. It's what you give your kid if they had an upset stomach. It was supposed to be good for stomach problems. But I also was able to find this advertisement for pitcher's Castoria from the late 1800s. And it was also used to get rid of tapeworms in your children. And actually, the advertisement says that if your kid doesn't pass their tapeworm in 2 hours, then you get your money back. So, so that was kind of terrifying, but it was pretty interesting. So based on all of that, I mean, all these artifacts kind of point to that late 1800s time period that we were looking for the post office. So we have to do more testing here, but it does kind of point to the fact that the post office might have been located in this area. All right, so the next area is the thing that really brought us out to Driftwood in the first place, and that's Mullet Farm in the Mystery Box. So this is where Mullet Farm is located, and the Mystery Box is in the side yard over here. As I mentioned earlier, Mullet Farm was built in 1910 by Barney Williams, then purchased by Mrs. Hallen's father in 1921, and she's lived there all her life. So based on her memories, we know that prior to Mullet Farm being built, there was also a shipbuilding yard in the area. So these are some early pictures of what Mullet Farm looked like during that time. You can see all the white sugar sand. She said it was a really nice little beachy area in front of it. During our archaeological survey, one of the first areas we excavated was the Mystery Box. As I mentioned before, one day a large hole opened up in Mrs. Hallen's backyard, revealing a subterranean wooden box. In the picture on the top left, you can see the gaping hole before we began excavating, which is right here. And we started in the northeast corner with a 50 by 50 centimeter unit, a little shovel test, to see what we would find. We then expanded it into a long trench in order to pick up on the builder's trench that had been formed when the box was constructed. So you can kind of see that there. So in the pictures on the bottom, you can also see that their mystery box made a fantastic jacuzzi. After some heavy rains, we would return the next day to find the unit almost completely filled with water. And then after a few hours of bailing, we were able to get it dry enough for a short period of time so we could continue excavating. But then we rapidly noticed that water was still coming in, so we had to keep bailing and excavating at the same time. So it's pretty fun. Gave us an excuse to wear galoshes, so we were pretty happy that day. Okay, here's a picture of the top of the box after we got it completely uncovered. We didn't do any excavating within the box, but we did use a probe to feel for the bottom of it. When we measured its dimensions, it came out to be about 4 feet wide by 4 feet long by 4 feet deep, so a pretty perfect square. We also noticed that on the north and south walls of the box were 2 large ceramic pipes that angled downward into the box. You can kind of make out one right here, and then there's another one right here as well. Based on this, our best idea for what the mystery box was used for is probably a cistern or a septic, but we really don't know for sure. While we didn't find any artifacts within the builder's trench, while we didn't find many artifacts within the builder's trench, mostly just construction debris like pieces of asphalt shingle and mortar and brick, we did find 2 interesting artifacts. First, in the east builder's trench, we uncovered a small red faceted bead, which is this one right here. After talking to some bead experts, we were able to figure out that this bead was probably made sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century. The other item that, of course, we found on the last day that we were working out there and sticking out of the wall at the bottom of the unit was this small glass druggist bottle. You can see in these pictures over here. It was made for the D.W. Budd Pharmacy, which had a store in downtown St. Pete during the early 1900s. Based on the maker's mark, as well as what we know about when this pharmacy was in operation, this bottle was probably made sometime between 1905 and 1916. Based on these 2 artifacts, our best guess is that the mystery box was built sometime around the time when Mullet Farm was constructed, in the early 1900s and possibly around 1910. Also in the area of Mullet Farm, we wanted to see if we could find any remains of the old shipyard that had once existed in the area. Mrs. Hallen had told us that her father had disassembled the old marine railways that used to put the newly built ships into the water and then buried the large metal pieces in a low spot in the yard. So Rich Estabrook from the FPAN Center at Crystal River was kind enough to come out with his GPR and test the area for us. You can see the results of the survey in the image here. In this area, there seems to be a large object about 20 to 30 centimeters below the surface. When we put a shovel test there, we uncovered a large iron beam around 20 to 30 centimeters below the surface. You can see it right here in the shovel test. Based on the story Mrs. Hallen told us, we think this might be related to the marine railway and the historic boatyard. We were also lucky enough to have Southeastern Archaeological Research donate their time to come out and complete an underwater remote sensing survey of Big Bayou. Here you can see the results of what we found. We got 2 areas of interest. This one up here probably relates to a 1920s era houseboat that sank in that area. And then this one right here was a pretty big hit, and this is right off the shore of Mullet Farm. So we think that might have something to do with the historic boatyard or maybe the marine railway. Some of the remains might be out here in the bay. Okay, so the last one I'm going to talk about is the speakeasy. And that was, we thought that this might be located, the residents thought this might be located in this lot right here. So when we were doing our shovel test survey in Mr. Skinner's backyard, where we were able to uncover a very large historic bottle dump. So it took us a really long time to excavate because it was chock full of bottles. You can see them all lying around out here, but it was a lot of fun. So here you can see this is a plan view picture of the bottom of this shovel test. And you can see we picked up right on the corner of the feature. So this is bottle dump, and then this is the outside of it. And you can see that a lot of the bottles were actually still intact, and some even still had their metal screw tops on the top of them. So it was really interesting. So as a project, we had USF undergraduate student Thomas Peterson. He did an internship with us, And it was his job to go through all the bottles that we uncovered and to figure out whatever he could about them. And actually, he presented at the last FAS meeting. He gave a really great presentation about what he was able to figure out. So first we looked at what kind of bottles made up the assemblage. So based on the shapes of the bottles, we were able to determine that 56% of them were related to food, like a pickle jar or mustard jar or sauces, things like that. 32% contained alcohol, and 12% we were unable to determine what they would have been used for. Of the alcohol bottles, we were able to find out that 76% were hard liquor, like whiskey or gin, things like that, and then 24% were from beer or wine. So they were obviously drinking a lot in this household, but we didn't know, this wasn't enough to tell us whether it would relate to a speakeasy. So the next thing we had to figure out was what time period did these bottles come from. So one of the first things we looked at was the design of the bottles. And a lot of them had really cool Art Deco designs. And we were actually able to find some of the design patents for those specific bottles, and a lot of them dated to the 1930s. The next thing we looked at was the labeling on some of the bottles. As you can see in these ones here, a lot of the bottles had printed labels on them, and that's what we would call an applied color label. And these didn't come into wide use, really. They didn't become really popular until about 1935. Also, a lot of the liquor bottles had this little warning on them. It says, "Federal law forbids the sale or reuse of this bottle." So there's actually a law put into place in 1933 that required that all liquor bottles had this warning on it. So we know that any bottle that has that on it has to post-date 1933. So based on that information and then the maker's marks that we were able to figure out on the bottom of the bottles, Thomas made a great little chart of the production date ranges for all the bottles. As you can see, some of them are really long, I mean going from like 1910 to the present day. But when we really started looking at it, we noticed that some of them fell into a much tighter date range. So when we took those out, put them in their own little graph, we were able to see some patterns. Oops. So when we include the date of when federal law forbids was required on bottles, which is 1933, and when applied color labels came into widespread use, which is 1935, we're able to really narrow down the date range of when these bottles could have been deposited. So based on that, and based on the fact that we know that the Bethel house lot that this feature was found on, the Bethel house was sold at auction in 1940 and then destroyed, and then the Driftwood era house was also built around that time. We think that this bottle dump feature probably dates somewhere between 1935 and 1940 when Driftwood really came in. And some of the other artifacts that we found also support this. These are all also found in the bottle dump. There were a couple personal items, like this is the arm to like a pair of eyeglasses. There's a button, some ceramics. We also found a lot of construction debris, like flat glass and wire mesh for screen for windows. And then this item right here is a part of a porcelain insulator tube for wiring. Now, porcelain tube wiring was used mostly from about like 1890 to 1930. And then after that, they figured out that it's really not that good for insulating wires because if anything touches the wire, it pretty much sets your whole house on fire. So after that, they stopped using it. So we really wouldn't expect to find porcelain tube wiring in a house that was constructed after 1930, like the Driftwood houses. So as you can see here, this is a modern day aerial of the area. And this here is the shovel test where the bottle dump was. As you can see, it's on this lot right here. This is where the Driftwood home is, and the road runs to the west of it. Well, what we were able to figure out by looking at some of the old maps is that the roads didn't always go this way. And originally, the road went to the other side of where the bottle dump is, and this shovel test and the feature that we found would have been directly behind this house right here. So any historical archaeologist will tell you that if you want to find where people were throwing out their garbage in the past, just walk out their back door, because that's exactly where they threw it, and that's usually where you'll find garbage dumps. So actually, I just got this yesterday, which is really exciting, but this is the 1926 aerial of the Big Bayou area. And this, you can see right here, this is where the shovel test would line up. And then this is the house, and then there's like a little orange grove and then an empty spot. So it appears that this deposit probably has more to do with this house, which is where the Bethels were living and lived in until like 1940, than it does with the Driftwood era home that would have been over here and was constructed around 1940. It might be due to them clearing out the house before it was demolished or something like that, but we really can't say for sure. We need to do more testing of the rest of the trash pit because we really only got a very small portion of it. So that's it. I'd just like to thank Ms. Helen O'Brien for all the wonderful information that she gave us, as well as all the Driftwood residents who let us dig up their yards, CGCAS, Dr. Wiseman's summer field school students, as well as all the USF students and others who volunteered to help us with our survey. We really couldn't have done it without them, so we really appreciate it. Thank you.